By the time Israel attacked Hamas leaders in Qatar on Tuesday, it had already hit Palestine, Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria all in a single month. And it's suspected to have fired drones on a boat heading to Gaza in Tunisia. Arab leaders immediately expressed their solidarity with their Gulf neighbor, which also happens to be a key U.S. ally. They condemned what they called a treacherous strike and a breach of Qatar's sovereignty. Qatar itself called Israel's strikes state terrorism. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu doubled down. He said that if Qatar does not get rid of the Hamas leadership in Doha, he will. Qatar also happens to have the largest American base in the region. President Donald Trump said he is not thrilled about the attack. Not the strongest words, maybe, but from Netanyahu's biggest supporter throughout the war on Gaza, it says something. But right now, they're just words. So the question is, what will be the fallout for Doha, the Gulf, and the wider region after this? And how will all of this test the relationship between the Gulf and their Western allies? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we look at what the Gulf states can do in response and what this means for Gaza. This is the first time Israel dares to bomb a Gulf country. Beyond the material damage, the killing of 5 Hamas members and a Qatari security officer, it also sends a chilling message. Nowhere is off limits for Israel. To read between the lines of what all of this means for Doha and its neighbors, I speak to Hassan Al-Hassan, Senior Fellow for Middle East Policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. This is the first time that anything like this has happened. As far as we're aware of it, anything of this magnitude certainly. Is the bigger problem here that Israel struck or killed some Hamas officials in Doha, or that it breached Qatari sovereignty?
This is a big deal. It is a game changer for multiple reasons. I think we've become accustomed to the fact that Israel will conduct assassination attempts using military force in other countries. That is not unprecedented. That's not a novelty, right? So the Israelis have gone after Hamas's leadership in Lebanon. They've gone after them in Iran. And now they've come after them in Doha. I think the real game changer here is that they chose to go after Hamas in Doha and to violate Doha's airspace and to violate Qatar's sovereignty. And in doing so, I think not only endanger the residential area and the residents living around the compound, but also endanger civil aviation in an airspace that is as congested as the GCC Gulf airspace is, and particularly Qatar, which is a very important global travel hub as well. It's not entirely surprising because there's a wider pattern of Israeli unrestrained military aggression throughout the region. We've seen the drone strikes on the Global Sumud flotilla in Tunisia, which were not claimed by Israel, but I think it's quite clear that it is probably Israel that's behind them. And then obviously unrestrained military aggression encompassing almost all of the region, starting with the occupied Palestinian territories, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Iran, and now Qatar.
What does this tell us about what Israel is capable of? I mean, we all know that Hamas officials reside in Doha. It's not a secret. And there aren't known Hamas officials in other Gulf states. Yet all the Gulf states have rallied behind Qatar and said this is simply unacceptable. Are they seeing this as something that might become a pattern? Especially with the reports that Israel's primary target, Khalil al-Hayya, has not been killed in that strike. Is there a fear that Israel is going to strike again? And what does it mean for Gulf states when there's a strike on one of them?
I think the real issue here isn't that Israel has demonstrated a capability that we did not know existed before. There's a general baseline expectation that Israel has the capability to conduct these type of operations. It is an engineered aspect of U.S. foreign and defense policy in the region to ensure that Israel has a qualitative military edge, which means that Israel will always have a leg up in military and defense terms, that it would always be able to defeat the Gulf states' defense and missile and air defense systems that rely to a large extent on cooperation with the U.S. This is not the surprise. The surprise is the U.S. factor, that the U.S. either failed to intervene and stop or prevent the attack, or even worse, that the U.S. may have actually facilitated or tacitly approved the attack on Qatar.
May I present a third option, which is that Israel did inform the U.S., but informed them way too late, late enough that even though if they had informed the Qataris, there would have been nothing that they could do. And that way, Israel would have also upset the US in a different way than the one that we know about.
That's the White House sort of claim. The White House claims that President Trump was informed by his own military and he was informed somewhat late in the game and that they tried to warn the Qataris. Now, the Qataris have already contradicted this by saying that the phone call from the US, presumably from US envoy Steve Witkoff, came after the bombs had already started falling. Now, the issue is that even if that's the case, even if the US and White House statement is true, Netanyahu already knew that he could do this and get away with it and not face repercussions from the US. So if Trump really is that upset, if he really sort of cares about the defense and security sort of relationship and partnership, if he's worried about protecting the US's reputation as a reliable defense and security provider, then by all means, he has a number of punitive measures that he could enact to truly signal his displeasure beyond empty rhetoric. But I think the real concern here is that there may have actually been US approval or a US facilitation of this. In any case, at best, the US is incapable of protecting and preventing such an attack by Israel against one of its closest defense and security partners, namely Qatar. At worst, the US is complicit in an attack that violated the sovereignty of one of its closest defense and security partners. It's pretty terrible either way.
So, what options do the Gulf states have at their disposal after this attack? What are they actually capable of doing, and what do we expect them to do in response?
The Gulf states have a number of options. Militarily speaking, it's not feasible for the Gulf states to engage or for Qatar to engage in military retaliation. But there are a number of diplomatic and economic levers of influence that Qatar and the rest of the Gulf states could pull in order to increase the pressure on Israel or signal their displeasure with the United States. One could very well imagine the Qataris throwing their weight behind the global coalition for the implementation of the two-state solution that Saudi Arabia is co-leading with a number of European partners and essentially advocate for wider recognition of Palestinian statehood. One could very well imagine the Qataris supporting the ongoing cases against Israel at the International Court of Justice or at the International Criminal Court. And one could imagine the Gulf states banding together through, let's say, an emergency summit. So there are a number of options in the near term for the Gulf states to take. The real question is how the Gulf states sort of recalibrate in the long term and what the options are for lessening their dependence on the United States, because at the moment they're not really well configured to deter and defend against a threat from Israel.
And it's a show of force and a show of unity and solidarity, definitely with Qatar, for the leaders of these regional countries, not only to come out and condemn strongly and everything, but to also go and visit. What do you think is going to come out of that meeting?
Regional perceptions of Israel had already been shifting ahead of the strike. And I think it was becoming quite clear that the Gulf states were converging gradually, and I think at varying paces, on the view that Israel poses at least an indirect threat to the security of the Arab Gulf states, presumably by engaging in war with Iran and endangering the security of the Gulf states and essentially bringing war to the doorstep of the GCC states, but also because of Israel's destabilizing policies that could end up posing real challenges for Jordan, Egypt, and others. I think now with the attacks on Doha, I think we will be heading towards a dual threat perception where Israel is seen, like Iran, to be posing a direct threat. Now, practically speaking, what steps are the leaders going to take over and beyond expressions of solidarity and leader-level visits? I don't know. I don't want to speculate, but I've already laid out the menu of options that I think are available to them. What they choose to decide, I think, will also be impacted by how the US's position on this evolves and whether President Trump truly, I think, is sincere about his displeasure or whether this is empty rhetoric, because the US factor matters and looms large for all of the actors in the region.
What does it mean for Qatar's role as a mediator between Israel and Hamas when Israel, for the second time, strikes the very people that it's negotiating with indirectly? I guess it's more than a clear message that it's not interested in negotiations and not interested in a diplomatic solution. So that aside, what does this mean for Qatar's role as a mediator and a US broker of peace, quote unquote, which it's so advocated to be seen as?
This is precisely one of the potentially very dangerous consequences of Israel's brazen attack on Qatar. The idea that mediating, trying to do the right thing, trying to resolve conflicts, de-escalate tensions, now carries a very significant risk. So I suspect, that this could truly dampen the appetites of countries in the region to take on further mediation role if this is the kind of risk that mediating is going to entail for their own security. And keep in mind, the Gulf states have played quite a significant role in trying to diffuse tensions and mediate conflicts. The Omanis were instrumental in brokering US-Iranian understanding on nuclear issues, and this was obviously spoiled by Israel's surprise attack on Tehran. The Omanis played a key role in de-escalating US Houthi tensions. The irony is that Qatari mediation has been actually quite instrumental to Israel, some of Israel's own interests in this war by brokering, for example, the release of Israeli hostages. So I think the message from Israel is clear. It's absolutely not interested in the success of mediation and of ceasefire attempts. But I think the broader risk is that this dampens the appetites of countries in the region, like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, and others, that have taken it upon themselves to mediate and to try and de-escalate tensions, not only for altruistic and moral reasons, but because this serves the strategic objective of creating the right kinds of regional security conditions that are necessary for economic growth and development.
There are Gulf states that have signed the Abraham Accords. Is there kind of a lever that they can pull or a card that they can play through that lens, through that Abraham Accords agreement?
One way to look at the Abraham Accords is as a source of diplomatic leverage that the UAE and Bahrain have vis-a-vis Israel. The issue is that I think activating the use of the Abraham Accords as a pressure point on Israel carries significant risk because it would be wholly inconsistent with what the Trump administration is trying to do. So I think there is a risk of potentially destabilizing relations with the US. The UAE has drawn a red line along the annexation of Gaza as something that could potentially trigger a reconsidering of the Abraham Accords. Bahrain so far has not signaled its willingness to go along with the UAE on this issue. So I think the question of whether the Abraham Accords are activated as a lever of influence, this is on the table, this is on the menu of options, but there are considerations around how the US might react and how closely the GCC states decide to coordinate their collective response to the Israeli attack on Doha.
So it goes without saying that Israel's normalization of Saudi Arabia is out the window further than it's potentially ever been, right?
I think it's been out of question for a long time now. I think ever since Saudi Arabia really took it upon itself to play a leading role in the global coalition for the implementation of the two-state solution. Ever since Netanyahu went on TV and said that if the Saudis wanted to establish a Palestinian state, they could do so on their own territory. And ever since I think Netanyahu spoke about his ambitions for a greater Israel, that poses a direct, I think, threat to Saudi Arabia. I think people need to pay serious attention to what the Saudis are saying. And the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been explicit and has been extremely clear that Saudi Arabia will not even contemplate the question, the possibility of normalization, without a clear pathway towards a two-state solution and a ceasefire in Gaza. And clearly, Israel is nowhere near interested in bringing about a peaceful end to this war. It's not interested at all in creating the conditions for a two-state solution. If anything, I think what the Israelis are clearly trying to do is resolve the Palestinian cause once and for all through famine, genocide, annexation, and ethnic cleansing.
This ripple effect of Israel's attack on Doha extends beyond Qatari borders. It has implications for Gaza, the West Bank, and even potentially the US-Israeli relationship. I discussed all of this with Hussein Ibish, resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and a columnist for The National. The ceasefire negotiations between Israel, the US, and Hamas seem to lag over and over again. They were not going anywhere. They seem to be gaining some momentum recently, but then Israel killed the negotiators for the second time. Are we to conclude safely that Israel never intended on resolving the Gaza situation diplomatically?
Absolutely. I think if by Israel you mean Prime Minister Netanyahu and his major cabinet colleagues, yes, I think that's clear. And I don't think they've been shy about that. When Joe Biden was pressuring them to discuss a ceasefire, they were very reticent about that. The only thing that pushed them in that direction was a combination of American pressure and the concern about getting some hostages back. At that point, there were over 100 hostages still alive, and well over 100. And I think the Israeli public is not dumb enough to fail to understand that the only way to get hostages back alive is through negotiations. When Biden presented his three-phase plan that included the first ceasefire of 60 days, and then negotiations for a second ceasefire, and then at the end of the second phase would have been the end of the war. And then phase three was reconstruction and rehabilitation, all that. Netanyahu wants nothing to do with that. He likes this war a lot. It's providing him with everything he needs to stay in power and stay out of jail.
But is Netanyahu just constantly calling Trump's bluff in seeing how far he can push the red line, even so far as hitting Qatar?
Trump doesn't have any red lines. No, let's be clear. I think we need to reconceptualize maybe the way in which we're thinking about the Netanyahu-Trump relationship. First of all, they don't like each other personally at all. Fine. But they're joined at the hip politically. They need each other politically. So Trump at this point has really only drawn a red line with Netanyahu once, and that was the end of the 12-day war with Iran. Let me go through this, though. When it came to starting the war with Iran, the 12-day war, Trump did not want to do it. He thought the timing was wrong. He was having talks with the Iranians. He told Netanyahu, don't do it. Netanyahu said, I'm going to do it. So Trump said, well, okay, let's see what you can do. In other words, he didn't exact any price because still sees Netanyahu as someone he just wants to keep on side, and he didn't really mind in the end. At the end of the 12 days, he thought, this is going pretty well so far, let me join. And he dropped his bunker busters on Fordo and what have you, and then he declared the war over. The next morning, he got wind that Israel was launching another major airstrike. And he got on TV and social media and started throwing F-bombs around and demanding Netanyahu turn the planes around. And that's the one and only time I can think of where he's really drawn a red line with Netanyahu and enforced it. Now, in this case, he might have stopped the Israelis from doing this if he knew enough in advance. In other words, I believe the Americans when they say, as they did from the very beginning in rumors in Washington, and now we're hearing it more in openly, that they only learned too late to stop it. I think that's probably true, because I think the Israelis remember when the Americans stopped them on the Iran thing, and they just didn't want to hear about it. But they knew there'd be no consequences.
The timing of the strike, too, is quite interesting, right? Because there's so much momentum to recognize Palestinian statehood among Western states. There's the UN upcoming conference. There's the Netanyahu ongoing corruption trial. Is this to derail everything? And will it be successful in doing so?
Yes and yes. It certainly was to derail matters because, yet again, Netanyahu has put killing Hamas figures above any other goal. I mean, it's very twisted, but it's perfectly in line with Netanyahu's attitude, which is priority number one is kill all the Hamas leaders you can. Priority number two, keep the war in Gaza going. Priority number three, continue the push towards annexation. Actually, really priority number one is push towards annexation in the West Bank. That's really the defining thing. But that's not urgent, like killing Hamas leaders where you have to take advantage of every opportunity. That's something you do on a daily basis, right? But any policy that conflicts with annexation in the West Bank will be done away with. If the Israelis suddenly were faced with a choice between slowing down the process of annexation in the West Bank and ending the war in Gaza, they would end the war in Gaza overnight. I mean, the annexation in the West Bank is the prime directive for Israel.
If nobody does stop Netanyahu immediately from carrying out another strike on Doha, potentially because Khalil al-Hayya does not seem to have been killed, according to Hamas, and now we all know as well that there are Hamas officials in Turkey as well. Is there a fear that Israel might strike Turkey? And what would that look like?
Look, Israel is in the business right now of showing it cannot be out-crazied by anybody. But I think an attack on Turkey would probably be a step too far even for Netanyahu. Because Turkey is a NATO member. And also, Turkey is capable of hitting back. If you hit Turkey, I mean, it's not like hitting Iran or a small country in the Gulf or anything like that. I mean, Turkey is a serious military power. If Israel took on Turkey militarily, in the long run, they'd probably have to resort to their nuclear bombs. I'm not suggesting there's any chance of an Israeli-Turkish war. But if something like that would take place, Israel's guarantee of survival is really its nukes. Now, what you might get is a drive-by shooting in Turkey. Something very targeted. That they might do. But like an aerial attack, such as the one in Qatar, I don't think so.
So what can be done? Is Donald Trump the only one that is capable of stopping them? And is there anything that Arab states who are seeing this as an attack on all of them, is there anything that they can do?
I think Gulf countries, especially, can move to protect themselves and I think they have already, by circling the wagons and saying, it doesn't matter what we think about Hamas, and it doesn't really matter the disagreements we've had over Qatar's policies. We are not going to fail to recognize that this attack is an attack on all of us. In other words, what again we're shown is we're vulnerable, just like when Saudi Aramco was attacked by Iran in 2019 and the US did nothing, and when Abu Dhabi was attacked by the Houthis and the US did nothing, and now Qatar has been attacked by Israel in 2025 and the US has done nothing. And you're sitting there asking yourself, okay, we have this primary strategic military partnership with the United States. What's it for? When does it ever kick in to our advantage? When do we ever get defended? And that's a question the Americans have to answer. At some point, it has to be made clear to the Americans that if they don't clarify when they're willing to use this massive military footprint in the region to defend their partners and allies and friends, then these countries are going to have to continue to look for alternatives and be much less interested in what Washington thinks and Washington does. So the Americans have to answer that. And I think if pushed hard enough, they will.
That's all for Beyond the Headlines this week. For more on our extensive coverage and analysis on Israel strikes on Doha and more, visit thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Ben Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.